I have a basic question about the scope of these societies. What size were these groups? Were they kind of uniform in size, and how often did they actually interact with each other?
So with Inuit societies, we are talking about in the Canadian and Greenlandic area, we're talking about very small populations. A maximum of 100 individuals. They would, in the fjord systems, and especially in Greenland, they would be scattered out, and so you would have a little settlement here, and then you could go maybe like 30, 40 miles, and there would be another little settlement, and so on. And they would congregate typically in the summertime. That is when it would be most comfortable, basically, because we are talking about an Arctic region, right?
I found the piece about animal spirits really intriguing, and I wonder if there's a parallel between that and, say, their belief in human spirits, and how that affected law in terms of violence between human beings and how they solved for that. Because I read a little bit about how when Western cultures started to colonize and rule over them, they changed their laws.
Yes. So we have some interesting historical precedent for this. So first of all, in Inuit languages, in Inuktitut and the primary language in Greenland, Kalaallisut, the word for human is very, very close to, or even the same as the word for this that they use for the animal spirit. Like in the Greenlandic languages, it's usually Inua, which is also the root of the word Inuit, which means humans. So in that sense, there's no linguistic distinction, or very little at least, between humans and animals. And that, of course, then you have to consider, well, since we're hunters and we subsist on these animals and we perceive them as having the same type of spirit as us, we don't have much distinction between ourselves and these animals. We, of course, have perhaps an ethical issue here in terms of, like, we kill these animals over here, but we tend to not kill humans. From what I know, historically, our precedent in terms of murder is very few. There's a lot of folklore around murder and cannibalism, which of course then should tell us that this was on their minds. This was something that we made sure to tell enough stories about so that people would consider the horror of that. Just like we tell horror stories in modern societies, right? Usually horror stories are centered around things that we find appalling and we find morally compromising in different ways. And that's the same for folklore in that sense. And so in Inuit societies, there's a focus on that. And in a few cases where we do see some condemned to death, for instance, it is in situations where their behavior is so extreme that they're unmanageable, and we're talking about serious mental illness. And there's a case from Canada where a community, I can't exactly remember the date, but it's in the colonial era, so it's in the 19th century. You have a community that decides that that this person needs to die because they are unruly and they're not just leaving, and so they kill that person, and all of a sudden they find themselves charged with murder by the Canadian government, right? Because they're handling the situation in the traditional way. And this was not an easy decision. It was something that came through multiple conversations in the group of elders before they even decided to act on it. And then we see the conflict with the colonial modern laws that stipulates thou shalt not kill, basically. And so there we have the problem, right? They didn't have the authority to do that according to the government. Of course, to them, they did have the authority to do that because this was about the safety of their community, right? So those are the situations that we see. But traditionally, we don't see much of murder and killing in these societies.
So this goes to your point about sort of having 7 moral rules for every society around the world, and how they more or less enforce those rules through their allegories, through their folklore. And then the government of Canada came in and said, no, you can't do it that way, you have to do it our way. That's what you're saying?
Yes, basically. And so since these rules seem to be pretty universal, that of course means that the Canadian government in that context was also operating with these rules somewhere in the deep foundation of human behavior, right? But the ways that these rules are configured, and the ways in which they play out, and the ways that we also as humans justify various actions in relation to them are of course very different depending on what society that we're dealing with. For instance, the one about property rights. In our Western societies, we know not to cross somebody's lawn because that's their personal piece of land. But that's not the same in these tribal societies that subsist on hunting. They don't have that concept, but on the other hand, they have another concept of property. They know the difference between yours and mine when it comes to clothing, when it comes to hunting gear, when it comes to reindeer, of course. So that's a different way of perceiving property, right? So in that sense, it's all humans share the idea and concept of property rights, but the way that we apply it in reality is very different.
So I wanted to back up just a second because I thought this was very interesting. And you mentioned, this kind of social prohibition against murder, and you mentioned specifically cannibalism, and it brought to actually, it brought me to probably the one thing that is sort of persisted from these cultures into modern sort of folklore telling, the story of the Wendigo. Being essentially the idea that if you eat somebody, you become a monster, right? Mm-hmm. And it seems to me that it's well, maybe it wasn't a literal monster, or maybe in the folklore it's a literal monster, but what they're actually saying is something like, if you do this, that is really monstrous. Mm-hmm. That is really way far out of what is acceptable for us. And I just find it interesting, if we're talking about, that symbolism and everything else, these ideas, and the fact that they had no real formal government other than sort of what they decide to organize themselves as, really, tribes, councils, whatever, those aren't really formal governments. They're just sort of, the community deciding who's going to speak for them. Mm-hmm. And I think that it's very interesting that, again, it's sort of we talked a little bit earlier about, how Iceland really didn't have the non-aggression principle, but we might be seeing the non-aggression principle kind of forming here in a more organic way.
There's actually a great example of this. One of the sort of the big folk tales of the Inuit is Giviuk. His life story. He's a shaman hero who, and it's an epic where he undergoes all kinds of trials and experiences as he's blown. First of all, the story begins in mythical time, where it is said that humans and the Tutalik, which is a human seal hybrid, live together. And there was such a human seal living in the community, and someone became jealous and then killed it or caused its death. It was mistaken for a seal. And so, the vengeance that was exacted upon the community by the Dudalik's mother, I believe it was, if I remember the story correct, was that when all the hunters were out hunting, they sent a storm, and they were blown. Of course, most of them drowned, except for Givio, who had been kind to the Dudalik, which of course tells you this basic principle of being kind to the other living beings around you. And then he undergoes this journey, and in one instance he happens upon a mother and daughter, and he becomes infatuated with the daughter, and they initiate a relationship. And the mother becomes jealous. Again, what we're seeing here is jealousy is a major issue in these communities too. This is something that you're constantly warning against. The mother becomes jealous, and as he's out hunting, the mother kills the daughter and takes her skin and puts it on. Some of these are also very gruesome, these tales. And then the next thing that happens is that he comes back and he thinks that it's the daughter that he's talking to because the mother is wearing the skin. And then she turns around and goes in, and then he realizes that she's wearing the skin. And then he becomes enraged, and he's like filled with this urge for revenge. But then a voice inside his head says, "It's not worth it. Turn around, leave." And then I think that is a major ethical, moral point that we're dealing with here. This situation that, you don't always have to respond to these aggressions with aggression. You can choose non-aggression as a response. And this situation was just so crazy that this is something that you need to leave. You need to get out of there as quickly as possible, right? So I think you're right. I think what we're seeing here is societies that in various ways have managed to mitigate and negotiate aspects of aggression, interhuman aggression, in a very different manner than what we otherwise know from Western societies. And going from there to more sedentary communities, as we see them among the Yupik, for instance, in Alaska, what we have there are very more like village structures, and this these such communities often form in the circumpolar region. They often form around the need for basically based off of the resources that they're hunting. So, for instance, if we have a community that is that subsists, for instance, primarily on whales, then you also seem to see a more a bigger community forming, and also more institutionalized ways of relating to one another. For instance, larger boats with a larger crew, somebody is a captain in a sense, and so on, right? So what we see there is, of course, resource extraction to some extent dictates the type of institutions that you construct, and secondly, choose to engage in, right? So, and then also what you see in such contexts are more, perhaps more sort of formalized interactions between villages. Again, very much in ritualized form. You have the inter-village festivals and such things.
And free trade.
And free trade, absolutely. And one of the interesting things about this free trade that you see with the communities in the circumpolar region is that a lot of that is also voluntary, offering up your resources without expecting anything in return. This is something that we see in many of these societies, that hunters will come back to the community even today, and they will share parts of the hunt with the people who are in need. And that, of course, is based off of this principle that, well, if I do this, my neighbors will also be doing this at some point. And that's, of course, something you very much need in such a society, because, you know, if you strike out of luck, then you might be, you know, starving for a period of time, and you're very vulnerable to the weather in the Arctic. We even see this also in the Scandinavian Viking societies. One of the ethics of the poem Hávamál, where Odin is sort of laying out all the wisdom and appropriate behavior. One of the ethics, one of the moral codes that we're dealing with here is always invite guests in. Again, what we're seeing here is this: you know, if somebody's traveling and asking for a night to stay in a bed at night at your farm, that is something that you do. And that is, of course, because everybody is recognizing that, you know, our access to resources, our exposure to weather is pretty extreme. So I would want that out there, and so I'm going to offer it to the person who asks over here.